Welcome viewers to this session of teleconferencing. Today's session is on a very important topic in economics. The title of our discussion today is Role of Political Institutions and Norms in Economic Development. This is a topic that we have derived from the course MEC 104 of the MAEC, that is MA Economics program at the School of Social Sciences. But of course, anybody who is interested in economic development and the reasons and the factors that go into promote economic development should find this talk or find this discussion to be of interest. Let us begin by considering what we mean by economic development. Or rather, what exactly is the difference between economic growth and economic development? Once we are clear about this, I think the rest of the discussion will have more meaning once we are able to clarify this difference. Economic growth, loosely speaking, is just the increase in the national income, broadly speaking, of a country, or it may be any subnational part or unit, but usually it is taken to be of a country. Now, a country which has a higher per capita income, that is income per head, is a more developed economy than the one which has a lower per capita income. Of course, we know, according to World Bank and according to many institutions, there are what earlier used to be called developed nations and underdeveloped nations. Then it got changed into developed and developing nations. Now we speak of upper income countries, middle income countries, low income countries, newly industrialized countries, and so on and so forth. They're all loosely based around the concept of a certain threshold level of per capita income. Why I'm stressing per capita income is that sometimes we talk of an economy growing that we'll have a GDP, that is a gross national product of so much, and a country says we are the largest, a country with the largest GDP, the country with the largest or the second largest GDP, and so on and so forth. But it is possible that a country may have a very high GDP, but not so high when it comes to per capita income. An example is China. China has a very one of the highest GDPs in the world, but when it comes to looking at a per capita income of China, that is what an average Chinese earns or produces in a year, that makes China fall into the category of developing nations. You might think China has a lot of economic power, but even today China is actually a developing nation. Now, that is one thing, that is broadly what economic growth is, and then we look at whether there are things like whether employment is increasing, whether social institutions are there, and so forth, but they are not considered so much as economic development is, as per capita income is concerned about when we talk of economic growth. There are problems with per capita income or even national income as an indicator of economic growth. One is, of course, that just the per capita income does not capture all the aspects of economic development or the economic transformation of a country. There are certain things that are not captured by per capita income, but there are other problems also. Per capita income is just the total increase in net value added, and that may come from a country might produce a lot of tanks and a lot of missiles and so on and so forth. It can justify on the grounds of having a hostile neighborhood and so on and so forth. Neighboring countries can be hostile to it. Therefore, it might feel that it needs so many weapons, but then this country might not have so much money left over to improve the welfare or the well-being of its people. So its per capita income or GDP might grow, but structurally it's not such a well-functioning nation. Therefore, economists make a distinction between economic growth, which is what we just considered, and economic development. And economic development is something more than economic growth. It takes per capita income as the may be a necessary condition for economic development, but it's certainly not a sufficient condition. You have to look at the social transformation of the country, whether there is a change in the institutional structures, whether there is a change in towards modernization. What are the changes? Is the economy still a primarily agricultural one, or is it moving away from agriculture to manufacturing to services? Whether inequality is increasing or decreasing, whether the absolute level of poverty in a country is going down. That's a very important indicator. So all these other things added to to the concept of per capita income, when we add that to the concept of economic growth, this brings us to the concept of economic development. Now, when we look at economic development, if you look at the slide that will come up in your screen in one moment, and when you look at the slide that is there, what it basically tries to say is that a per capita income is, or rather the main factors in economic development, there are two kinds of basically causes. Now, let us explore the causes of economic growth, right, or economic development. For a long time, economists focused on the factors of production because people thought that when production increases, then economic growth takes place. So people thought whether there is an increase in labor productivity, whether there's an increase in capital productivity, and so on and so forth, and which among them is more important. But what happens is that economic development is, of course, more than that. So these economic factors, incentives, economic factors like capital productivity, income, economic factors like total factor productivity, capital formation, whether savings is going up, what causes growth, or whether exports of a country are increasing, that leads to an economic growth. So that, or economic development, because economic development necessarily has economic growth as a component. We'll be talking of economic development, but you can substitute economic growth and vice versa for our purposes of this discussion. So what economists did was, economists looked at these economic factors, and these were known as proximate reasons. Proximate means which are nearby reasons. So, well, fine, there was a lot of talk about when economists constituted growth models, theoretical analyses of economic growth and economic development. Economists said, okay, what does cause growth? Some said capital, or rather machines and machinery, equipment is more important. Somebody said, no, it's human capital that is more important, so on and so forth. But these were all what are known as proximate causes, nearby causes. In recent decades, economists and other social scientists have sought to investigate and examine whether there are other causes behind these proximate causes. And these causes behind these proximate causes can themselves sometimes be non-economic in nature. What that tries to essentially see is that, okay, you're looking at why growth takes place in a nation, or let's say why this nation is growing faster than the other nation, or there are examples. For instance, if you take Argentina and South Korea, or certain countries which were at the same level of development at the end of Second World War, and suddenly you find Korea developing tremendously over the next few decades, and it is an economic powerhouse now. Most of our consumer goods are Korean companies, and so on and so forth. So one tends to wonder what exactly explains this development. If it is economic factors like exports, worker productivity, capital growth, is there something behind these which in turn influence these causes that eventually lead to economic growth? Okay. So people started to look at whether there are reasons. Some said, well, and these second round of causes were known as fundamental causes of economic growth. Okay. Now, if you look at the slide, right? Next slide. Let us now begin by defining institutions, because what we are getting at is that institutions are the basic fundamental causes behind these proximate causes. So people thought that the economic factors are themselves developed, influenced by the economic causes. Now, if you go back to the slide and take a look at the slide, it seeks to define institutions through the words of a Nobel laureate in economics, Douglas North, who says that institutions are basically the rules of the game in society. You play a game and there are certain rules. So he says when society organizes its production or its activities, and there are certain so-called rules within inverted commas, you may say, these broadly speaking are institutions, or he also called them more formally defined as the constraints that shape human interactions. Because economic growth comes from economic activity. Economic activity means people are forever interacting with each other. A worker is interacting with his employer. A farmer is employing with the person to whom he's going to sell his produce, the buyers interacting with the sellers, and so on and so forth. The government is interacting with the people in the country to get taxes, to spend some. So all the time people are interacting. And are there any rules, or then set of rules which when lead to repeated interactions that happens? So this is loosely speaking institutions, and we'll develop the idea of political institutions for them. Now let us further look at the meaning of institutions. First, they are human devised. Why I am saying this is important is because some people have given some non-economic factors as fundamental causes of development. A chief non-economic factor that is being put forward is sometimes geographical factors. Let's say some people have said all the developing countries which were poor, got poor and stayed poor in modern times and are now developing, are all near or around or on the equator, the tropics, where there is too much heat. Summer is very intense. That saps people's productivity at a fundamental level. People are not able to work as hard as people in colder climates, and therefore geography is sought to be an important factor. But we will not consider that. That is still under analysis. People are not too sure about what to do. Certainly that is a factor, but again, that is not what we are discussing today. So if you go back to the slide, we say that institutions are human devised rules of the game. And as we saw, that the rules of the game are both can be formal and informal rules. There are informal interactions in villages and other social interactions. They are through informal, and there are formal relations like formal employment contracts, formal laws that govern society and economic interactions. And if you take a look at the slide just once again, then you will see the third effect is the third point is quite important, that institutions are important. How are they important? They work through manipulating incentives. So people are very, very, controlled or influenced by incentives. So if a society can organize incentives in a way that induces people to work hard or increase their productivity, that's a development. Now we relate institutions to economic development, and we say that economic development is a complex phenomenon. We have just discussed that at the beginning, that it is a complex phenomenon involving growth, it involves structural change, and here is the link. Political and social institutions also get affected, and as we were saying, poverty and inequality levels of a country also are indicators of levels of development. Why I am showing you this slide is because this phrase, political and social institutions, these are both constituents of development as well as influencers of development. So then this makes the story interesting. What is it about economic and social and political institutions that can influence the economic development of a nation? Now, as the topic of our today's discussion, as what we have been discussing is primarily about political institutions, let us see what political institutions do. Basically, political institutions, you can say institutions of democracy, institutions of elections, institutions of political politicians who have power and who allocate resources in the society. So what political institutions do is that they allocate political power. And when they allocate political power, that influences the development of political institutions. So what happens is there are political institutions which are designed to allocate political power, and this allocation of political power in turn influences the basic structure of political institutions. This happens all the time in democracy. Political institutions, moreover, shape the incentives of the political executive. Now, why I'm saying this is why this is important is because if you consider a dictatorship, in a dictatorship, the political leader may be so immune to public opinion, or he doesn't care. Supposing he is a dictator, then even if he has poor performance and so on and so forth, that can influence the level of development which may not be very high. Whereas in a democratic institutions, let's say if nothing else but the compulsion of elections, a politician in his or her constituency has to show economic performance, that politician, in order to be re-elected, let us say, or to be elected, does certain actually good works, tries to is incentivized to work so that the economic institutions or economic arrangements in his constituency and so forth, his constituency, his area, as such that leads to greater efficiency and productivity. And finally, the institutions should not display rent-seeking behavior. What is rent-seeking behavior? Because what happens is, if there is rent-seeking behavior, it hinders economic institutions to flourish. And on the opposite side, if there is no rent-seeking behavior, it in turn helps economic institutions to flourish and not have economic power. See, rent-seeking institutions are, rent means here not the rent of a house that you have rented out, not like that. Rent-seeking institution means is the amount that political classes get by simply facilitating the economic arrangements in society. It may be outright corruption, it may be outright bribes, or it may be in influences in other way. What happens is that in the economic sphere, those institutions or those sellers or those groups, economic groups that are more powerful, can influence the political executive or the political institutions into making decisions that are, or taking steps that are of favor to those economic parties. So the powerful become more powerful, they can influence the political decision making, which will in turn affect the economic atmosphere or scenario in the country to their benefit. We see that this sometimes is attempted by what are called interest groups or pressure groups in society. For instance, Rich Farmers Association or the business houses, associations in India like ASSOCHAM or FICCI, they try to influence the political executive, who in turn will influence, let's say, the budget, the national budget provisions in the budget, or who will influence the monetary policy of a country, or even the export-import policy, which might help these people. So there should not be any rent-seeking behavior in the society. Then the political institutions can have the maximum influence on the economic institutions. Now take a look at the next slide. What is the role that political institutions play? First, in a market economy, where the means of production are not owned by the government but in private hands, property rights should be very strictly enforced. If there are no property rights, then what happens is people are not incentivized into earning profits, or if people, let's say in a society where there is no rule of law, there are gangsters and all, even if somebody works and he feels that he can be robbed, or there can be burglary, or some gangster can take away his land, capture his land, then he will have no incentive he'll move over to a different place, or maybe not be so incentivized to work. So property rights have to be very clearly, or someone knows that this is my factory, this is my car, and nobody can lay claim on it. So these should be clear. Secondly, similar thing, there should be an enforcement of contracts. So take a look at the second thing on the slide. It says enforcement of contracts. What does enforcement of contracts mean? It means that when two parties agree to a decision or agree to a transaction, agree to an exchange, both parties should honor that contract. Of course, if there is not, one can go for litigation, and that litigation in turn might increase the incomes of lawyers and judges and so on and so forth. That goes up in society. But if every transaction takes is contested, if some contracts are not upheld, then it sends a message to the rest of the society, or even for outsiders, that in this society, political functioning or economic functioning is not smooth. All this we are discussing to get to the fact that economic interactions or economic development is embedded in a political situation, a political structure, or social arrangements. So that is why political framework or the political scaffolding, so to say, is very important for economic development to flourish. If there are good political institutions, they will lower transaction costs. Transaction cost means what? Transaction cost means the cost of carrying out the transactions themselves. If you carry out the transactions, and if it takes long time, for instance, let us say you want to buy a house and somebody wants to sell his house to you, you want to buy a house. If there are complicated legal and administrative, first you have to get a permission from this agency, go to that authorities, get clearance from here, do this, undertake this step, only then the two parties can come together to effect a contract, or buying and selling of a house, or a second-hand good, or whatever. It has happened in many overly regulated society. Then it increases the cost. It increases the cost apart from the price of the transaction. The house may itself have a value, but over and above, both the buyer and seller may have psychological costs incurred, time costs incurred, other administrative costs incurred, merely to carry out one transaction. And if this multiplies in society, you can imagine the kind of disincentive this injects into the society, so that efficiency is adversely affected. Which brings us to the next point, that good political institutions will and do channel and create incentives, designing of incentives. And in today's context, in recent times, behavioral economist Richard Thaler has also introduced a term called nudge. Nudge means that people are not regulated, people are not controlled, but people are, like in the English very word itself, given incentives, economic and non-economic, so that they take economic decisions which is to the benefit of the whole society, to themselves, and for everyone else. A related concept of that is what is called merit good. For instance, the government wants you, if you ride a two-wheeler, the government wants you to be safe. So government doesn't provide you with helmets. Government wants you to spend your money to buy a helmet, so that if you are safe, then you are safe, plus you are a productive member of society. It is good for society, and it is good for your welfare, your family's welfare. So you are making the decision, but you have, here it may be legal compulsion, otherwise you may be fined. But in certain cases, if the government is not so strict in legality, government just nudges you, pushes into, slowly shoves you into a certain direction to take the right incentive. That is also there. So designing of incentives by political institutions and creation of those political institutions which create incentives, which can nudge people into decisions, is very important. And this brings us to the last point related, is there is a debate. Are democratic societies better at fostering economic development than non-democratic one? In recent times, this debate has gained ground when people contrast India and China. It is true that when around the late 1940s, let's say around 1949 when China adopted socialism, China and India were more or less at the same level of development. Since the early 80s, beginning with 1978, China initiated reforms. They privatized their agriculture and so on and so forth. We know they took many reforms. They went in for technological innovation. They incentivized the society so that innovations in production takes place. The people were, what was called moral suasion. They were injected with so-called national character, pride for China and so on and so forth. They did all sorts of things. India has been doing remarkably well in economy as well since 1991, no doubt. But then China, many indicators considered, does seem to be a little ahead in the race. Now, many people have said India has a constant, India has a weakness because India is a democratic country. A democracy cannot be ruthless. A democratic country cannot be harsh towards the very people whose conditions they want to improve. And China is it may be economically a capitalist country for all practical purposes, but then it is still governed by one party which calls itself the Communist Party. It may have no characteristics of communism, but the name of the party is Communist Party, which is like a dictator like any other party. About 35 odd years back, there was something called Tiananmen Square where the students protested in China, but that was ruthlessly crushed down. We know there are sporadic incidents in Hong Kong. And these kind of things are also talked about of Singapore. It is a city-state, but it is so efficient, it is clean, but then people say it is an authoritarian regime. So people start to wonder, are democracies worse at fostering development with their political institutions than non-democratic ones? I think the answer, broad and largely speaking, is yes, democracies are better because some autocracies may function well economically, but then that is not because they are autocratic, because there are many dictatorships which do very, very poorly on economic grounds. And lastly, we will now consider finally very quickly about the norms. Norms means when outside the political, social people in society themselves get together to carry out certain common activities or interact with themselves. There's something called the tragedy of the commons, which means in a grazing land, if too many people take their animals to graze and those grazing is overgrazed, then everybody will have less land to graze. So that's what is called a disincentive. So people have to follow the logic of collective action. So norms have to be decided so that nobody gets too selfish there. People can work together, work collectively. And what is called the free rider problem is avoided. Free rider problem means that if in a group it is required that everybody has to contribute something, some people may say, well, everybody else is contributing, why should I do? I'll just take the benefits of that. So then they take the benefits and therefore they are try to not do their bit. This in turn disincentivizes the other people and they don't do. So all these things lead to the conclusion that political institutions and norms are very, very important. Excuse me. So today we have discussed the role of norms very briefly, but largely the role of political institutions in fostering economic development. We have seen that political institutions are fundamental. They in turn influence and affect economic factors which lead to economic growth. So I hope you have gained something, and if you have any questions to ask, feel free to ask. Feel free to write to us and we'll be very happy to answer all your questions. And you can think of it, and when you read MEC 104, I want you to read that with this added, discussion at the back of your head and relate it to all the other units. That will help you to get a very, very complete picture of the entire course. So I hope you have some insight now into the economic development question and what causes economic development. Is it only economic factors? We say an emphatic no, because behind the economic factors are political factors. So thank you, viewers. Thank you very much for attending this session.